Well, we started this part one and part two on socialization with what is socialization and the agents of socialization. And now we're going to consider sociological and psychosociological theories of human development. Now, part of the reason for doing this is it helps us grasp all of the elements that are involved and contribute to how we become who we are and how we understand this is who we are. And therefore sort of explore the world and meet with the people and support and show and demonstrate who we are. So we will also see how socialization continues throughout life. We don't stop socializing as children. We continue through adolescence, in our adulthood, and even into our older age. And we'll also consider resocialization as a concept. All right, let's get on with this. Let's start with gender socialization, just to recap. It's the aspect of socialization that contains specific messages and practices concerning the nature of being female or male in a specific group or society. Now, some of the sources, this can come from family, social class, schools, peer, media, even the computer and social media. The effects, well, what does it mean to be masculine and feminine? Now, gender socialization varies among diverse ethnic and social class groupings. Gender socialization is important in determining what we think the preferred sex of a child should be, and influencing our beliefs about acceptable behavior for what it is to be male or for what it is to be female. All the social agents can have a huge impact on our socialization for gender socialization from kindergarten through to college. Teachers, peers reward gender appropriate attitudes and behavior. Sports reinforce traditional gender roles through the rigid division of events into male and female categories, or what males should do and what females can do. The media is also very powerful source of gender socialization from an early age. Children's books, television programs, movies, music provides subtle and not so subtle messages about masculinity and feminine behavior. So what we want to jump into, though, is inclusive with gender socialization is self-concept. And we're going to look at some of the sociological theories into the development in terms of our development, of which self-concept is a big part of it. Now we're going to begin, when you look at your self-concept, this is making up of all your traits, your beliefs, your abilities, the values, your social relationships, the things that you hold true and important to you, your goals. Your self-concept is your totality of your beliefs and feelings about yourself. Now there's been a lot of theorists that have looked at the self-concept. And we're going to begin with the symbolic interactionalist perspective, but most notably that of Charles Cooley. Now, we'll touch in on Mead as well. They have had a history of looking at the self. Now, looking at, from what Cooley introduced, he introduced what's known as the looking glass self, where we imagine how our personality and appearances look to others. We also imagine how others judge our appearance and personality. And if we think of, others' view of us, is it positive or is it negative? And our self is either enhanced or diminished by this. So what you're seeing there is a graphic that basically illustrates the looking glass self. Now this is going back a ways in terms of what he's basically inferring here is that a great deal of who we are comes from the interactions we have with other people. Now, some of that sense comes from what do we think of ourselves, and then, in light of what we think about ourselves and how others react to us, is that the same? Is it different? Does it enhance how I think about myself, or does it diminish? And so it has a lot, this initial thinking was introducing this relationship of our self coming from within and our self coming from external stimuli. So we're going to carry on with this and look at some of the central concepts that George Mead introduced around role-taking. Now, role-taking is the process by which a person mentally assumes the role of another person in order to understand the world from that person's point of view. And we see this sometimes in the way that we see children imitate, and this is them trying to get a handle on what it is to be a mom or a dad or an adult or a cook or playing house. And role-taking happens all through life, but it happens a lot in our children's life. Now, my daughter, when she was at daycare, part of the way that I was parenting my daughter was to give her some choices, but I would frame the choices. And so I often would say, well, Kate, it's time for bed. Do you want to get started on your own, or do you want me to help you? And so by framing the choices, it wasn't about whether you're going to go to bed. It was, do you want my help, or do you want to go on your own and get started? And the way this played out in daycare was, I was a behavior consultant for many years, and I'd go to daycares and schools and help teachers and parents with their children. And I was there for another reason, and I saw my daughter playing house with a young lad, and she ended up saying to him, like, hey, let's go shopping. And he said, nah, I don't want to go shopping. And then I heard her go, well, do you want to walk to the shopping center, or do you want to drive? Now here she was learning from me. She was role-taking, if you will, and introducing it into her play experience at daycare. I thought that was pretty, and what made me laugh. Now, one other component that really is introduced during this period was what's known as the significant other. And the significant other are persons who, now this is where it's important to distinguish here. A significant other are persons whose care, affection, and approval are especially desired and who are most important in the development of self. Now, what's important about this, and I've always held this to be very true, is that a child, if you will, chooses who are those people that they hold to be most important to them. And so, as an adult, it made me wonder, well, when am I a significant other to a child? I would never know. I was involved with children's lives lots. I've consulted with hundreds of daycares and children's organizations and met with probably thousands of children in my life. And I don't know which ones would have seen me as a significant other, because I don't know who they would recognize or what traits they would see in me that would value to them and attach themselves and pay attention more carefully to the things that I would say. So it's important that when you're seeing the term significant other, consider yourself. You don't know when you're a significant other for a child. Of course, you would assume that as the mother or father or uncle or aunt, you would be a significant other to a child that you're related to. But you don't know when, under being a coach, a neighbor, a person in the neighborhood, when you will be that person that is a significant other to a child, because the child doesn't say to you, hey, you're my significant other. But they see things in us that when we say things back to them, they take it to heart more. So hold on to that notion when you're around children. You don't know when you're that significant other to them. Now, Mead went on and did some other work. And one of the areas that he did some work in is what we call the I versus me. And the I represents the spontaneous individual's aspect of oneself, the subjective part, the me looking, or the I looking at me. Whereas the me is the awareness of a societal attitude and expectations. It was more objective. Now, what was being proposed here was that there was a stage of development of a child moving from I and seeing the world as revolving around them, and seeing a me which has a social component to it. And there was 3 stages to this development. There was a preparatory stage where the child would assume no role. It would be more strictly imitation. This is between 0 and 3 or under 3 years old. And they were mimicking and preparing to take roles. And then 2 was the play stage. And this is where they're practicing taking roles. This would happen between 3 and 5. And they would be pretending. I used to enjoy watching kids in the daycare because when they started to play house, you would see them pretending to be their own parents. And so you would get insight into what happens in their household, because they didn't have an imagination past seeing their own parents, and so they would be basically pretending to be their parents at this stage of play. And then the 3rd stage is game, taking the new role of others into many different situations. And here, now they're not only taking a role, but they're aware of that role in the relationship to others, and so that's a broader sense of self. So this moving from I to me is incorporating and developing a social self. Who am I in relationship to other people? So we've looked at briefly, and this is, I emphasize briefly, a sociological perspective of human development. Now let's look at a social psychological development theories here. And basically what we're going to be looking at is looking at Freud, Piaget, Kohlberg, and Gilligan. This is not Gilligan of Gilligan's Island, for those of you who are old enough to know what that is. Now, it's also worth noting, we're just skimming over this. I've taught courses just on Freud, Piaget, and Kohlberg. 14 weeks, 3 hours a day. So there's 3 hours a week. So this is big content we're going to do very quickly. Now, with Freud, the stages of human development focus on three interrelated forces. Now remember, Freud is of an older school and talk about the unconscious. Now for him, the unconscious was things that we weren't aware of, and so he looked at these interrelated forces as being partly a part of that. And you see the iceberg. So the things beneath the level of the water is the unconscious, things that you're not aware of. You can't think about them because they're not something you're aware of. They're unconscious. The stuff above the water is what is conscious. So for him, if we look at the three parts, the id, ego, and superego are the three parts. The id is the part that contains our basic biological drives and needs, and they demand immediate attention. Now you notice, it's a big area of our unconscious. But in order to balance out the id, it's the ego that acts as a bit of a balance to it. The ego filters and contains the id and attempts to meet the id's needs, but it will do so when it's at the best advantage of the person. And then lastly, it's the superego that is the sort of check and balance for both the id and the ego, and it's our conscience. It's where the moral and ethical part of our personality exists. Now, he brought along, this is older school perspective, and it introduces this play between three areas of our consciousness that helps develop the sense of who we are. But if we move into another psychologist, his name is Jean Piaget, and he instead took a slightly different approach. The issue to him was cognitive development, and he was interested in how we think. And Piaget believed that there were stages to our cognitive development, and children needed to go through all these stages in the order in which they occur. You couldn't jump from one to another, skip one, and that children would proceed through these stages in relatively the same amount of time. And so as we age, we change how we think, and that includes our sense of who we are. So the concepts that he went through were the sensory-motor, which was between birth and age 2, the pre-operational 2 to 7, concrete operational 7 to 11, and the formal operational, which is after the age of 12 through adolescence. Now, I won't go through a lot of the detail of this. You find the bits that you may need to be aware of in relationship to our class in sociology in your textbook. So we're not going to expand on it a great deal. Now, the next person who had some influence in this social psychological theories of development didn't look at cognitive, but he instead started to look at moral development and where that came from. Now, Kohlberg, in looking at moral development, followed the lead of Piaget, sort of, in that Kohlberg came up with a series of stages through a person's life where they focused on moral dilemmas. And he classified moral reasoning with a level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 being pre-conventional morality, level 2 being conventional, and level 3 being post-conventional. And if you look at the stages 1 and 2, you get the idea that level 1 is around obedience and punishment, level 2 is a little more interpersonal, and then level 3 is more social. And so he was looking at stages, as did Piaget. And so our development didn't just occur in our childhood, it was appearing to go throughout our life in many aspects. So who we are and our self-concept and our sense of self and development in our society isn't just in our childhood, it extends throughout our life. Now, researcher Carol Gilligan, she challenged Kohlberg's work and said that the issue that he brought up on morality seemed to have a bias, and so she saw there to be a gender issue missing. She was a major critic of Kohlberg's theory, and Kohlberg's model was developed solely on the basis of research of male respondents. And so women and men are often divergent in their views on morality based on some of these differences in socialization and life experience. And she thought that that was missing and ought to have been included. So when we think in terms of socialization through the life course, well, why is socialization a life process? Well, we go through stages, we go through growth, we go through time, and things that we are expected to know and achieve and be able to represent change over that time. So we continue to learn throughout our life as we experience a change in status, like going to university, getting our first job, marrying. We learn a whole new set of rules, roles, and relationships. So we have what's known as anticipatory socialization. This is the process by which knowledge and skills are learned for future roles. So that new job you're planning on, college students go to class to establish some new information, new skill sets, which is essentially pre-job socialization. So when we think in terms of the kinds of stages we can go through, infancy and childhood is of course the first one. We've already sort of touched on how a lot of our socialization occurs in our childhood. Central to the concern here is it's during infancy and early childhood. Family support and guidance are crucial in the early stages to helping us as children develop our sense of self and our self-concept. Now, some of the central activities related here, it's carefree play, exploration, if you will. Some areas of safety, certainly. It introduces what's good, what's right, what's wrong, what's bad. Freedom from economic and political and sexual responsibilities is not something in childhood, hopefully, we ever have to deal with. Just play, interact, learn, be supported, be loved, and cared for. Now there are, of course, issues in this socialization time period of childhood and infancy. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse occurs and can occur. It's negative outcomes for children and their development. So we have a wide range of elements that can influence children early on, which can have long-term impact later on in life. And so it becomes a very important and critical period of socialization. But it's not the only one. We continue on with our socialization in adolescence. In industrialized societies, this is the stage that represents a buffer between childhood and adulthood. Some of the common themes here, it's at a time of emotional and social unrest, partly because it's a time of separating from being a child to before we actually get to be an adult. We're trying out things for size, seeing what fits, what doesn't fit. Some struggle with the conflict between parental wishes and peer pressure. And it's a transition for the upper and middle class families into higher education. So we see this period of adolescence as being really important in terms of, well, how does it transfer from childhood and what we learned there into our adolescence, and how, the impact of choice, making choices about what we want and don't want and who we associate with, and how do we balance that between what we learned as children and what we're learning and being exposed to from and with peers. The third stage is that of adulthood. Now in adulthood there's three focuses or three foci. One is it's the period of time when we're entering into the workforce and into the paid labor force. Now whether that be working for somebody else or working for ourselves. Secondly, it's the development of intimate relationships. Now we will have introduced ourselves to that in adolescence, but usually in adulthood, intimate relationships that often result in marriage and having children. And so in adulthood, the socialization involves starting a family, how am I going to be a father or how am I going to be a mother. You're influenced by your adolescence and your childhood, but you are also enabled to have free choices to how that will happen for you. And so there's learning how to be a father and a mother and a family. And that's part of socialization too. It's the time in which our lives brings us these sorts of opportunities, which we then continue to learn how to be amongst all the other things that we're doing. So when we look at adulthood, we can also consider that there's an additional stage, and we can call this late adulthood. And I'm going to introduce another topic in this area, and it's called ageism, and we'll come to that in a minute. With the aging population, baby boomers growing up, and they're not only getting old, but they're aging longer than have historically been the case. We've had improved medical care and improved nutrition throughout the lives of many of the baby boomers, that they're living longer, and the late adulthood can often be diffused into three categories. The first category would be known as the young old. These were people 65 to 74. It seems kind of odd to be calling someone young even though they're old at 65 to 75. And then there's the old. This is people 75 to 85, and then the oldest old would be over 85. Now the reason why this is an interesting sort of period of time when we look at late adulthood is it used to be, not that long ago, that 65 to 70 was considered maximum age that people would grow to. But like I said, medical, nutrition, physical fitness, the interest that people have in their own health has really augmented and made it possible for people to live healthfully and happily later into life. And so some of the tips that people have for successful aging would be many elderly comment on the experiences of having some financial security, planning for your old age. You have more freedom, not tied to as many socially structured environments. You don't have to work if you've planned well for your security in your old age. Many more people who are older are healthier and happier than they've been in the past. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are suffering, or not people who are doing poorly or having health concerns, but with the large number of people in that demographic age group, many more of them are healthier and happier than they would have been in the past. Now I touched base on ageism. The topic of ageism is prejudice and discrimination. Now, prejudice is the thought, discrimination is the action. So it's prejudice and discrimination against people on the basis of age, particularly against older people, but it's not exclusive. Adolescents could be experiencing ageism, not having opportunities because of their age. So ageism isn't specifically about the old. It just seems that it affects the old a lot in terms of, well, you can't work, you can't contribute to society, you're too old. You can't do this and you can't do that because you're too old. All right, so that's part of where we're at in terms of socialization over the time. It'll be curious to see how this divides out in another 50 years when you're in my age group. Resocialization. Well, it probably you have an imagination of what that might be given what the term is. It's the process of learning new and different sets of attitudes, values, and behaviors from those that we previously had in our background. Now, there's many times that you will be re-socialized in different circumstances. It could include career choices, or, as we're going to see here, voluntarily or involuntarily. Voluntarily would be a variety of things. Maybe you've had a drinking problem and you went through AA. That would be a voluntary way of relearning new attitudes, new values, and new behaviors as associates with drinking. Adult survivors of child abuse go through resocialization. Getting involved into the Army. It's a resocialization, and it's something you might voluntarily do. Now, involuntarily, again, it could be, there was a time in my lifetime where you could be subscripted into the Army. That would have been involuntarily joining the Army, and you would have been socialized. But more typically, we'd see it in jails. Going to jail means you need to be re-socialized, how to re-enter into society. Or if you've, in another very extreme example, would be brainwashing. Involuntarily learning attitudes and values and new behaviors. The occult, ISIS, would be examples where that might take place and would be a part of re-socializing. All right, so there we are, out of the realm of out of socialization. Now I have posted a little video that kind of gives you a snapshot of what the role of socialization can do. So I hope you pay attention to that too. It's also in week 6 folder. Good luck, everybody. Keep up the good work.